I've been looking forward to interviewing Scott Cowx for the longest time, and I've had my head in my rear end a bit, Scott, but I finally got you. I'm so glad to have you. Welcome to this On the Mark show.
Well, certainly my pleasure, and one of the podcasts that I certainly listen to, Mark. I mean, you've got some very wide range of guests that I think are obviously a credit to the teaching world, but also some of the other guests that you've had in the world of golf and your experience, obviously as a commentator and so on. Certainly, I think you do a great job with that. So I'm really looking forward to spending some time with you.
Man, you're very kind. I'm supposed to be giving the glowing reports about the guests, so no, you've turned me around here. Scott, look, you former Canadian PGA Teacher of the Year. You're highly regarded. When it comes to great golf instructors turning to you for biomechanical insights about the golf swing and body movement and such, you like one of the guys. You're on speed dial for a bunch. So I want you to tee us off because I think a lot of golfers are kind of loath when they hear about data and information, and they're afraid that, like, hold on, I'm going to lose my feel. But you look at how the body moves biomechanically, and you actually advise us to move more efficiently, more injury free, add et cetera, et cetera. So start us there with the biomechanical insights, and let's help people to sort of go, okay, this is the future of it, and this is how we get better.
Well, certainly, I was blessed early on. I think it was 1996. I spent a week down with David Ledbetter at Lake Nona back in those days. And at the time, I was sort of a young pro and kind of just like all of us want to play for a living and kind of get into that realm. And I was a decent junior, but I wasn't a standout junior. So this was an opportunity for me to improve myself. And David really helped me out. And Brian Mogg was another guy that was there at the time and kind of help get me started, if you will. And as a young teaching pro, I'd go and teach some lessons at the municipal course that I was at, and obviously I'm going to apply what if whatever David taught me was going to be relevant to everyone, and very quickly realized that wasn't the case. So that kind of left me on a search, if you will, where I talked to a lot of bright minds. Dr. Scott Lephart at the University of Pittsburgh Medical. He had kind of the first biomechanics lab in North America dedicated to golf. And he was very good friends with Greg Norman and had tested Greg as well as a number of tour players on strength and mobilities and so on and so forth, and try to make sense of what made a golfer great from a physical standpoint.
Yeah.
So I was lucky to spend some time with him. I was lucky to spend some time with Chris Welch, who I think was one of the pioneers. This is around the year 2000 on some ground reaction forces. He was talking about shear forces and what we now call AP forces,
Yeah.
even way back when in the year 2000. So we really have to thank those sort of pioneers, if you will. And as a golf pro, as you know, I think it's important that we're able to take some of this information that we get from some good sources, the scientists and so on, and be able to apply that with an appropriate brush for the student in front of us. And, there is no be all and end all. And that's kind of what I learned from a lot of those early sources. Um, I had the first sort of biomechanics. It was a K vest back in 2006. I had the
I had
first
one
one
of
of those
those.
in Canada. Yeah, I was the first one in Canada to get one of those. And, for about 2 months, I ruined people because I was teaching the averages, right? And that was sort of, we'll call it the lazy way of going about it, where, hey, if this is what KVS says, I should just follow that redundantly.
Hmm.
And very quickly realized again that that wasn't the right way. And I had to, treat everyone as an individual. And so that kind of left me in a bit of search in terms of what exactly can I do with all these different joints. Each one of us has a certain set of joints. It gets a lot of fun when you're talking about players who might have limitations in the joint, or sometimes disabled players who may not have a joint,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
kind of coming up with solutions for all of those people, as well as your able-bodied tour player or your young junior who is capable of doing a lot of things. So that got me interested in a lot of those ideas, and that's kind of where my background came. And I think from that, there's been a lot of instructors now worldwide have gone through my coaching certifications up to about I think it's around 3,500 pros now worldwide have gone through level one at least of my certification, and it really just talks about the way joints move and how we can apply those joints to our golf swing. So the way I look at it is it's kind of like building something out of Lego. I've got a bunch of Lego pieces on the table, and today I'm going to assemble a car, but tomorrow I'm going to rip it all apart and maybe assemble a house.
Yeah.
And if we understand those underlying pieces, we can really kind of build any pattern or any swing. And that's kind of the tools that I try and give the coaches that I mentor. I also do an insider circle, as we call it, which is sort of a post grad, if you will, for a lot of these coaches that have gone through the certifications. And, for example, we talked about one of the patterns today. So usually about once a week, I'll do a class on a certain topic,
Mm-hmm.
and allows coaches to be interactive and ask questions and talk about things. And it gives me a lot of perspective as a coach, just because some of the questions that I get, I don't necessarily know the answers. But I'm certainly going to try and find out.
Well,
And I think one of my mentors in the game is sort of Chuck Cook, and Chuck, I love Chuck, and to his credit, I mean, he's still going strong at, I think, almost 80 years old now, and he still has a desire to be better at his craft, to be better, a communicator, a better understanding of what happens in a golf swing. And this is someone that certainly doesn't owe anybody or owe anything to anybody in terms of obviously the performance across their career. So that's who I hope to be, if you will. I hope to keep learning and hopefully helping others with their clients all around the world.
well, I believe the measure of a man is the legacy he leaves. And you've had such an influence on so many aspirants and even great young instructors and instructors young and old around the world. And it's a testament to who you are, what you do, your knowledge, your expertise, and such. Now, folks, to that, you obviously know Scott now and his approach to things. So you've heard how Scott, and the statement I loved was what you made where you said to treat everyone as an individual and not sort of teach the averages is what, and that's because what so many instructors do when they get a launch monitor or they get what KVS back in the day, but now it's some sort of force plates or just anything they're using where they read
Right.
the manual and then they don't know how to apply said information. But with all that said, folks, I said to Scott, I'm like, I want you to go through all this data that you've assembled through all the years, and let's talk about four elements that you see as a common that you sort of see as a commonality amongst some of the great strikers and swingers you've worked with and researched. And Scott, folks, quickly came back with a list of four things here, and we're going to go through them. And the beauty about what you've put together here, Scott, is as I look at it, it's sort of all encompassing about the golf swing. It's not like you're looking at one specific area. You're talking about balance and you're talking about, how the club works in transition, and you're talking about joints, range of motion and their smoothness, and then where the center of mass of the golf club's located. So you're hitting us with everything. But let's start at the very start. And you talk about not just balance, but dynamic balance. And all the great swingers and all the efficient golf swings exhibit dynamic balance. So explain what that is and help us to better dynamic balance, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in that list, I didn't want to get too, kind of, let's say, pigeonholed into some pattern development or modeling. These are, as you said, kind of traits that we see with great swings. And those great swings do have different, we'll call it geometries or different sort of rules, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
with those patterns. However, when we see, great performers, number one, we see very good dynamic balance. And dynamic balance is just a fancy term for saying, hey, I can move very violently, very quickly, but still retain some semblance of let's say, stability and balance.
Yeah.
And that club, as it flies around our body at approximately 100 miles an hour, there's about 70 pounds of pulling force on the player
Mm-hmm.
right at the moment of impact. When that club's moving the fastest, that club is kind of pulling ourselves around. So a lot of the movements that we make in our golf swing would be akin to somebody that does the hammer throw.
Yeah.
And I've had a lot of conversation. One of my clients is actually a former hammer throw um, sort of contestant in college, and we talked about that thing I think weighs 35 pounds or something crazy, and this thing's whipping around the body, and the player is obviously, or the contestant is spinning around and counterbalancing
Yeah.
the weight of that hammer. And very much the same thing, we see that with a lot of juniors when they first start out. They've got this golf club which weighs about a pound,
Mm-hmm.
and it's speed around the body is pulling them off balance, so they get a overly long and loose backswing. They lose their balance. They trip and fall at the end of their swing, and a lot of it's because of the inertia, the centrifugal force of that club is pulling them off balance. So one of the things that we have to learn in golf, and one of the limitations, if you will, for speed production, is our dynamic balance.
Yeah.
And certainly we see this as players get older. We get to a certain age, especially as they get into their 70s and 80s, where they can't really balance on one foot. They can't really do much, let's say, within the hip joint and sort of stabilize the knee and the hip.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, they end up with a swing that's about waist height to waist height, right? They don't end up with any length to the golf swing. Right. Well, one of the
I'm
things when we
55
look
and
at
I'm
that,
feeling that already.
and by the way, you did some research on me, but I also did some research on you. I was scrolling through Instagram there. I was looking at some of those swings, but
So my
when we
backswing.
look, well, when we look at, for example, really quickly, just as an off topic here, we have 4 laws of clubhead speed, right? There's only 4 things that you can actually do to speed up the club.
Mm-hmm.
And number 1 is the length of opportunity in the linear fashion. So what that means is basically, if I want to go faster on a ski hill, I'm going to pick a bigger, steeper ski hill so I can hit more speed at the bottom. So length of opportunity, which is really the distance that your hands basically travel throughout the swing, or the bigger the circle I can make.
Yeah.
So that is by far law number 1. That is the low-hanging fruit. So I saw you maybe a week or 2 ago doing some exercise where you were working on lengthening your backswing.
TRX
right? Now
bands,
that,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And that is your quickest, fastest way for anybody who's watching the podcast here to get more distance, lengthen out the potential opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a couple of caveats with that in terms I need to do that in a balanced fashion so I can change direction dynamically and very powerfully. And we'll get to that in the second piece here. The second law of clubhead speed is what we call the linear work, or basically how much energy can I pump along the circle. So linear speed is basically you're speeding up the club head and the club and the grip, simultaneously. So think of throwing a spear as you're speeding up both ends of that implement. Well, the early part of your downswing, you're speeding up both the grip and the club head somewhat simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
The second half of the golf swing, we have the angular component where we're slowing down the grip and obviously allowing the club head to speed up. So we also have 2 potential energies there. We have the length of opportunity. We'll call that your lag angle, if you will. And then we have how hard, if you will, can I allow this to come out or snap the wrist, or however I'm going to get those angles out. Okay. Now, this is the error, if you will, in the golf industry. For 100 years, we've been telling people if they want to hit it further, they need to lag it more. But that comes with a little bit of an asterisk, because if we lag it more, often you got to rob Peter to pay Paul. So you've got to rob out the linear speed to get the angular angles out. So you end up slowing down the pivot, stalling out the body to be able to get those angles out.
Mm-hmm.
So for some players who are very, very powerful in their hands and wrists, they can do that. They can do that and maybe increase their speeds a little bit. But when we actually look at the science, and by the way, all this data comes from Dr. Sasha McKenzie and Phil Cheatham and their forces and torques, which I did years and years ago when I was searching for some of this detail. And when we look at the amount of work that's done, most of the clubhead speed that you're producing is actually from the linear.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the work that I put into it in a linear fashion is more important. It's about 80% of all the work that I put into a golf swing is in the linear fashion.
Okay.
And about 20% of the work is actually done at the wrist level. Now, I say work. I'm not saying that the clubhead isn't increasing in speed, because as we decelerate the handle, we're creating an acceleration or inertia of the clubhead. But in terms of actual physical work, it's about 80-20. Now, some players be a little more, some players be a little less. Okay. but we've been looking at it all wrong. And this is why you can look at some swings that have tremendous lag angles, but there's no club head speed.
Yeah.
Okay. And we see that sometimes with some of our juniors and even some of our young players who maybe lack the physical strength to be able to pump a bunch of this linear work into the swing. So, anyways, the reason I wanted to explain that really quick is when we look at this dynamic balance is we've got to be able to change direction very, very, very quickly, very powerfully. Now, hopefully, very smoothly.
Yep.
Okay. But it is done in time. Now, the eye gets confused between slow and smooth. Okay. So when a player moves very quickly, but
Say
does
that
it very
I want you to
smoothly.
say that again, because that's one of those statements that's going to get lost in the wash, really, with all this information
Yeah.
you're hearing. But you got that so right, because so many people, because look, it's swing it smooth is one of those, I call it Advil for the golf swing. Some dudes miss hit a few
Right.
shots and his buddies are like, you're going too fast. I want
Right.
you to say that again. Let's not confuse slow and smooth, please.
Correct. So prime example, okay, fellow countryman Ernie
Yeah.
Els. If you take a look at how fast Ernie Els goes from setup to the top of his backswing back to impact is actually faster than what Greg Norman used to do. Now, anybody that would see Greg Norman would see this sort of vicious cut at the ball, especially
Uh,
80s Greg Norman,
yeah.
right? Have this vicious cut at the ball. But if you actually look at the timing of the swing, Ernie Els was quicker than Greg Norman. Now, Ernie would be obviously very, very, very smooth and fluid with the movements. And that kind of goes into our third point about joint smoothness, et cetera,
Mhm.
is that disguises speed. Okay. So that's why you got to look at swings a little bit differently. Sometimes look at the timings of the swing.
Yeah.
Okay. And, one last point just before we get into that point, it's a nice lead in into the second piece there between the P3 to P5 timings. But we look at the dynamic balances. I've got to be able to change direction. So the average tour player swings the club back approximately about 30 miles an hour. So I've got 30 miles an hour of momentum in this backswing
Okay.
that I've got to be able to stop and change direction or loop or do whatever I'm going to do to be able to go the other way.
Mhm.
So there's so much of our energy is being, sort of absorbed in my ability to change direction.
Yeah.
So the analogy I like to use with people is like, okay, if you and I, Mark, we're going to do a dragster race here, and you've got your souped up car, and I've got my car, and I'm going to make it tougher for you because you've got to throw it in reverse first before you put it into gear.
Mhm.
That's essentially what we're doing in the golf swing. Is it's throwing ourselves backward before we throw ourselves forward, and we can imagine the amount of torque that would put on your engine if you went from reverse really hard to obviously forward really hard.
Exactly.
And that's kind of what we're asking the body to do. So this ability to do that in a balanced state, without herky jerking all over the place and having our inclination to the ground and our spine angle massively change is something that all golfers need to learn. And basically is one of the big inhibitors for players getting faster is they simply can't change direction dynamically in balance. And
Yes.
that's hard.
Yeah. Okay. My mind is awash here, but I want to respond with two quick observations, let you react, and then go on to the chest height to chest height observation you have already teased. Um, I'm 55. I've been teaching golf since 1996. I want to think that I've done a lot of things wrong, but the one thing I've done right, and it was because my brother Trevor is 9 years younger than me, and we kept him in lightweight junior clubs for a long time. And my daughter, same thing. And everyone comments on my daughter Isabel's golf swing and my brother's, how they look fundamentally sound. But I see so many parents now. This is a word to you, you parents, that your kid picks up a bigger, longer driver, hits the ball farther because there's just more mass. But all of that shear that they can't manage because they're not strong enough ruins golf swings. Then they spend the rest of their lives trying to build this dynamic balance that you speak of. Would you like care to elaborate there?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I've seen it both ways, to be truthful. I've seen some players respond reasonably well. I mean, famous story, Rory McIlroy learned with his dad's not cut down golf clubs.
Okay.
So one of the reasons why early Rory was maybe a little bit, we'll say a little bit deep and behind himself and,
The
you
clubs.
know, um, slightly different pattern than he is in now, probably stems from the fact that those clubs were pulling him around.
Mhm.
But he's the one in 100,000 that could maybe handle that and be able to learn to change directions with that.
Yeah.
But that fierce deceleration of the pelvis that Rory would exhibit, a lot of that was because the weight of the club is he had to crank his pivot really, really hard and then stop really hard to be able to get that club, let's say, in a reasonable position out in front of him at impact.
Mm.
And like I said, maybe he's the one in 100,000. To your point, I think that when you've got players, you've got to learn to scale that when you're working with your juniors and say, okay, here's the right time where maybe it's a little short or maybe it's a little bit light, but we're not going to jump straight into the adult set. We're going to, look at this every 6 months if they're a high developing junior to, let's say, every year to year and a half with most of our juniors. We don't know when they're going to go through puberty, when they're going to get their growth spurt, when they're going to get their strength. All of those things are obviously unpredictable. So to your point, I think that if I can handle the club weight dynamically, and that just takes obviously a camera and maybe a little bit of trial and error. Here's a weight of club. Let's see you swing it. And if you see, let's say, a lot of speed wobbling and things like that in the
Hmm.
swing, might be, hey, let's go with a little lighter swing weight until we can handle this.
Hmm.
And like I said, it's definitely one of the challenges, as you know, in junior golf development is being able to recommend and obviously have the right equipment in their hands at the right times.
What I do want to add real fast too, because I love your description of dynamic balance. And I've seen countless juniors, as I'm sure you have, where little John, let's call him, he's 14. He's in playing with larger golf clubs, and then they're popping up on their toes for impact, and dad's moms are freaking out. But I'm like, the counterbalance you mentioned, they're going in the opposite direction of this golf club, and they're trying to create leverage and also not land the club way too early. So it's almost a necessary evil when they're coming up. Would you care to elaborate there?
Absolutely. It's one of the things that I certainly early in my career taught out of them, which I shouldn't have, in
Mhm.
hindsight, a lot of that sort of fancy footwork, we'll call it, is exactly that. That's the player jumping against the pulling weight of the club and trying to remain balanced. So we see a lot of these juniors getting pulled forward, their scapula get pulled up their back a little bit, they get a little hunchy.
Mhm.
Like all these things are because they're not physically strong enough yet in the shoulders to support the weight of that club swinging around them.
Yeah.
Um, the way I kind of tell the parents a little bit, because sometimes the parents obviously have a little bit of input in that, like, well, the footwork's really messy or really up on the toes and so on, is I kind of say to them, I said, listen, I'm over 200 pounds here. If I jump and little Johnny over here jumps the same amount and puts the same force into the ground, he gets off the ground and I don't.
Yeah, true.
And as time goes by, that player is going to get heavier. And, some of that footwork will kind of quiet down to a certain extent as they get a little bit heavier. So it's something that, maybe I would deal with that a little bit more with my late teens or some of my mini tour or tour player guys if it's a problem. But a lot of times I'll certainly now leave that alone with the juniors if it's going to help them with their speed production.
Hmm.
As you know, as a 12-year-old, if you can hit it far enough and chip and putt, you're going to be fairly competitive as a junior golfer. We don't need to hit a 5 iron 200 yards and stop it on a dime at 12 years old.
Yeah.
Um, Certainly, as they develop into an adult or into a college level player, certainly we're going to build some other skills there. But I would probably do that a little bit differently than I did maybe 20 years ago.
Well, you and me both. That's why I appreciate your wisdom and your candor as well. Um, let's do this. Let's go. And so that was dynamic balance, and you shared, how to go about it. You talked about some of the laws of adding club head speed, logically so, and then you wanted to talk about the chest height to chest height, or if you're measuring in P's, it's P3 through P5. Now I want to tee
Yeah,
you off with this.
Yeah,
And
exactly. And this is something I did. I did some research on this years ago. There was a company that made some sensors. This is maybe 10 to 15 years ago called ZEP.
Okay.
And Zepp made some sensors that went on your glove, and I was doing a little bit of research and so on. And one of the things that I looked at was transitional speed, right? So case in point goes into this dynamic balance, but basically very long hitters from chest height to the top of their swing back to chest height, okay, take under 4/10 of a second. Okay, so Rory McIlroy, 2025 Rory McIlroy at 189 whatever ball speed takes 0.36 seconds to go from P3 or mid chest height back down to P5 mid chest height. And so that transitional speed is very, very quick. Now, when we look at, one of the slower club head speeds on the PGA Tour, that player takes a little bit over zero point 0.5 seconds. Now, that doesn't seem like much. That's a lot of time in a golf swing. You're talking about basically 0.14 hundredths of a second, or 14 hundredths of a second slower in that part of the golf swing. So when we look at club head speed, and there was a paper maybe that further illustrates this. I can't remember who wrote it, unfortunately, but it was a brilliant little paper based on exactly that. And what we found was Jim Furyk at 6'3" had 109 miles an hour, and Rory McIlroy at 5'8", 5'9" had 124 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And they simply broke the swing into pieces and said, here's where it was traveling a certain speed, and here's where it was traveling a certain speed. And Jim Furyk's swing obviously has that loop. In fact, the club head was moving about 15 miles an hour through the transitional area. By the time it got down to just a little bit around, waist height, in this case, the club was moving about, it was moving 48 miles an hour.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
By the time it got down to impact, he had increased that by 60 miles an hour. He had about 108 miles an hour club head speed. Now, Rory McIlroy, in the same token, at the same time in the swing, the club head was actually moving 64 miles an hour. Now, funny enough, he also only gained 60 miles an hour in that same time frame.
Yeah, interesting.
So again, we've been taught in this industry that it's all at the bottom, all the speeds at the bottom. It's like, no, the work and the power is being created way before that. The release of that angular energy, that inertia, and so on, is being capitalized certainly at the bottom, but the work potential is earlier than that. So Rory was 16 miles an hour faster between the top of his swing and around waist height than Jim Furyk was, even though he was a smaller player and obviously very quick player. But you'd think a guy like Jim Furyk at 6'3" would have the potential, if you will, for more distance and speed.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so that transitional speed, when we look at it, and that's a very easy one. You can just clock your swing. If you go into, Coach Now or one of these apps, you can slow that down and look at it. But you'll find that your longest hitters in the world are under 4/10 of a second. About 10 or 12 years ago, I was doing some speed work on my own swing. I was swinging around 108 to 110 miles an hour, roughly. Did some work there. I was 0.49 seconds between P3 and P5. With some transitional work and some balance and a little bit of gym stuff, I was able to get that down to 0.42 seconds. Now, again, 7/100ths of a second doesn't seem like much. That's a big, big improvement. My club speed jumped from 108 to 117.
Okay.
So that part of the swing is critical, absolutely critical to this. Now, one last little point on that is if we're going to improve our club head speed there, we have to understand that it's not a nice linear progression. So to get 10% faster, you need 30% more work.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So the analogy I like to use with this is when they built the Bugatti Veyron, the supercar, and they was going 200 miles an hour, they had to double the horsepower to get it to go 250 miles an hour. So when we look at the actual work in terms of newtons, and this stuff again comes from guys like Sasha McKenzie, very smart scientists here, but to get 110 miles an hour club head speed, you need somewhere around 340 newtons of force being applied to the golf club.
Right.
And that's a combination of both this linear work that we talked about as well as the angular work. To go and get 120 miles an hour, so 10 miles an hour faster, you needed 440 newtons of force.
Okay. All right. Mm-hmm.
Now, long story short, fast forward that to long drive guys who are swinging 150 miles an hour. They are putting somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 to 750 newtons of force into the grip in less than 2/10 of a second. It's insane. I
Insane.
mean, it's like lifting 300 pounds up over your head off the floor. I mean, the strength of these players to be able to do that is incredible. Um, so it's all about work and that work and where you position the work.
Okay.
So I
I
was
forgive me.
yeah, go ahead.
Forgive me, because my main goal with this podcast is always to introduce the bright mind in Scott, and then to have the viewer and the listener come away with the information, but that like I understand something. Because, gosh, if I had $1 for every golfer that misunderstood one or other lesson because it was, they came away with a not wrong information, but they didn't get what they were doing, they're ruining their own games. So I want to go here because everyone's hearing, and you talk to legends, and they're like, "Well, my transition was smooth," and so again, smooth becomes slow. Okay, so there's the mistake. But I want you to just explain this a little bit more, because I fear, Scott, that I'm going to see a bunch of folks after listening to this podcast, and this is the responsible teacher within, that they're like, I heard Scott, I'm believing it, and then they're
Right.
freaking ripping this handle back in front of them like this, and they're actually not applying the force created appropriately. Where a lot of these guys that are applying that force, it's some of it's length of backswing, a large part of it. It's the movement of the body. It's how the arms are working away from one. It's not like taking the top of the backswing and just tugging it down in front of you. Am I correct in that?
Well, I think, and this is where it becomes again very, very individual. A guy like Bryson feels it a lot in his arms and his shoulders.
Yeah.
Other players are going to feel it more transitionally with, let's say, a lateral shift. Rory gets it from what we call a center mass displacement. He drops very, very quickly. So there are different ways, and the best way to kind of think of that for players is if I go to the gym and I put my arms up in a cable pulley back here somewhere,
Yeah.
and I said, okay, if I put 10 pounds on the cable pulley, I can pull that down very easily with just my arms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I put 100 pounds on that cable pulley, you're going to see a completely different engagement of the
Exactly.
body.
Mm-hmm.
To your point, you're going to see them lower. You're going to see them pull forward with their, we'll call it a weight shift.
Yeah.
You're going to see all of those things to create some momentum to be able to then pull these arms down. So it's not necessarily that the arms aren't working, it's just when, right? So we want those early kind of stages of the downswing. And again, this is where I think fast and smooth gets hidden as slow, in the fact that they're able to do this in a very coordinated, smooth fashion with those bigger muscles of the trunk and the hips and the legs to at least initiate that early downswing. Most players will have some contribution, obviously, with the arms at some point, but hopefully it's not, as you said, right away. So we're not just snatching that down with no inkling of what the body's doing, because we run out of gas, essentially. There comes a point where I just can't keep pulling on this. I want to keep basically applying a force to that handle as long as I can. That kind of leads us maybe into our third point there,
Wait,
which is
I gotta stop you, folks. I love this
yeah,
man.
go ahead.
He's in his office. He's got a whiteboard behind him and he's written down the notes. If you're listening on audio, you got to go watch this on YouTube. Yeah, tremendous. Before you go there, tremendous explanation of, like, if you were in the gym, what you'd be doing. Because again, the arms wouldn't suck into you, wouldn't collapse. You'd be engaging everything to maintain the force on the golf club as you work from P3 through P5. Okay. Now you, again, this is a beautiful segue into what you talked about, joint ranges of motion, and be able to move smoothly with the joints. So please elaborate for us.
Yeah. So example, if we look at, let's say, the pelvis, which I think, we could spend days just talking about how the pelvis can work and not work and dysfunctions in the pelvis and so on. There's so many attachments there between, let's say, the hamstrings, the adductors, and, some of the low back muscles. All of these things are going to influence the ability, the hip flexors are going to influence the ability for us to rotate within the joint. So most of us, who are sitting or standing around all day, our hip flexors get a little tight, or we get a little bit of low back pain by the end of the day, as you know, as a coach. you're probably not in a
I've got
great
this.
position to be
I've got
able.
the turtle posture. You leaned over like
Oh,
yeah.
100%,
Yeah.
and that's just gravity working against us, unfortunately. But when we look at those ranges of motion, so we need to have a reasonable range of motion. In theory, I think we're supposed to have somewhere around 45 degrees of internal and external rotation within the hip joint.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem is we're in a golf swing that we're bent over, our mass is bent over, we got this club flying around our body, and here we are trying to control this very, um, reasonably large range of motion, but do it in a very stable fashion.
Yeah.
And if we think of a rusty door hinge that kind of pops the door hinge and the door kind of doesn't close properly, that's how most of us are walking around every day. So if we
Mm-hmm.
oiled up those door hinges and had this very smooth, fluid motion there, then the force I'm applying from a muscular standpoint is actually going to accelerate, in this case, the pelvis. So that's where when we look at general mobility programs, and certainly as we get older, over 50 like you and I are, at that time I think the mobility level is a much greater thing to do. It's not that we've lost necessarily a ton of strength, but we certainly lost some of those ranges of motion. One of the things when I look at a golf swing is how much contribution am I getting at different levels? How much are the ankles, knees, and hips kind of moving, if you will, to create this movement? How much is the T spine, the thoracic spine moving? How much is the shoulder girdle kind of being active? How much sort of what we call lead arm adduction? Anyway, there's a lot of different areas that we can look at motion, if you will, within that golf swing.
Mm-hmm.
And generally, when we see a young, fast player, they are having, extensive ranges of motion, usually somewhat limited on purpose in the pelvis because thoracically they're incredibly mobile.
Yeah.
So they tend to maybe, only have 30, 35 degrees of, let's say, pelvic turn within the joints, but they're able to get 60 degrees of thoracic turn in the upper spine.
Mm-hmm.
As we get older, I think that number has to increase in the pelvis to
Dwindles.
be able, yeah, to be able to get the same ranges of motion in the thorax
Mm-hmm.
to get a full turn. When we start looking at players that are might have some injuries, some bad hips, bad knees, bad ankles, that has a great kind of trickle effect, if you will, all the way through the system on in terms of what they do. So anything that we can do to build smoothness within the joints. So one of the things I try and get some of my let's say older players to do is to do some very, very light weights, whether they're doing some simple exercises, just putting, a club across their shoulders. I'll have them stand on one foot and just practice internal rotation, external rotation within the joint. And you can kind of film them as they do that. And you'll see this thing popping around and moving
Yeah.
kind of herky jerky because those are all the muscles that are, kind of shortened or tight that are inhibiting this movement. So there may be, I've got a great sort of referral list of PTs and yoga instructors and so on that I use to help obviously rehab some of those things for some of my players. If you're looking at an elite performer, your tour player, they've obviously got a very extensive team around them who are taking care of that body and looking at those things at all times. So it's kind of like an F1 racing team
Yeah.
versus, I'm taking the go-kart to the track on the weekend. That's about the level of difference between your average golfer and obviously what the tour players are doing in terms of the amount of preparation that they're doing for that. So
You
that
know,
joint smoothness is incredibly important as well as the ranges of motion. So anything that you can do, anyone listening that can make hip movements in particular, because that's the major segment that's closest to the ground that has to have a lot of rotation.
mm-hmm.
So for most guys, we tend to get locked up in our hips quite a bit. Anything that you can do, the splits is something, if you try and do the splits, you're doing a lot of good things. The adductors on the inside of your thighs are being stretched. Also helps your hamstring flexibility, also helps greater ranges of movement laterally within the pelvis when we practice doing the splits. I'm not saying you get all the way down, but that type of a stretch is very, very, very good. We've all seen Miguel Angel Jimenez and
Oh
his,
yes.
kind of pre-round workout. I mean, that's a very smart man, if you will. He's addressing a lot of areas of the body that really, as we get older, don't work so well. So
What's
kudos to him.
Yeah, what's curious about when people see Miguel's warm up, everyone thinks it's hilarious, but you're right. He's doing yeoman's work there to prepare his body. And this gets me to thinking, and I'm going right back to where you began, Scott. And this is, folks, if you're listening, you should be getting the wisdom of this man here, this guest, where you treat everyone as an individual. Yet, yes, let's say it's me. Um, I can't tell you. I put a video up there on social, and I hit 7-iron, and my arms are my left arm was parallel with the ground at the top of my backswing. And
Yeah.
just for giggles on Instagram, I'm like trying to lengthen my backswing. What should I do? Well, you should have seen all the responses I got. And if if you had responded, you would have said, "Hey, go do some mobility work, go do some Pilates and such." Now I'm saying that, and I want you to come in the heels of this, where some golfer is going to a lesson with someone, and the pivot's short, and then the teacher is like, "You gotta pivot bigger, you gotta wind up, you gotta coil more," but they just don't have that ability to do that. So essentially, they are aiming for a goal that is unachievable, really, and it's going to turn into heartache and failure in the end.
Well, it has to be exceptionally strong, right? Obviously, there's some exceptions. You got your JB Holmes and your Tony Finau and even John Rahm, who, can generate immense amounts of club head speed. But even there, in Tony Finau's case, I remember there was a video a few years ago of him on social going all the way up, big long backswing with 139-mile-an-hour club head speed.
Yeah.
And, his normal gamer little short, P3 swing, if you will, was, 126 or something like that. So he has the capability, certainly, of a lot more in the tank. But for most players, to your point, is they're limited, and so we have to, sometimes go outside of our own profession a little bit to look for some help. I can state the obvious and say, hey, your swing's too short, and you need to make it longer if we want to create some more speed. But sometimes that goes beyond the scope of my expertise in terms of, let's say there's a medical hindrance, where for whatever reason this player's got they've got a fused spine. Their body just isn't going to be able to do what you want to do. So now you're looking at that individual saying, okay, well, let's either address this in a way that we can, and maybe there's some potential there, or I've got to create the best swing I can with what I'm working with.
Mhm.
And, we might alter the pattern, if you will, or alter the way we do things based on that player's individually. Now, the one point about that P3 to 5, which I failed to make, which is really important, is the reason I took those two swings, Rory McIlroy and the other swing, the slow swing, was they were approximately the same length.
Yeah.
So, for example, your P3 to 5 measurement would be very small
Yeah.
because it only gets a little bit past P3. You
Hmm.
understand?
Yeah.
So there's a distance that this also has to travel within that time frame. So when you look at a player like a Jamie Sadlowski, for example, long
Gosh.
drive,
Yeah.
and you look at where that is,
Uh-huh.
and he's taking somewhere around, the whole downswing is somewhere around 0.18 seconds, okay, which is insane. It's
He was
under
super.
two
That
tenths of
guy
a
was
second.
superhuman for as small as what he was. How hard he hit it.
Absolutely. Yeah, unbelievable. I'm 5'10" and 170 pounds. A very, very interesting one for us to study because obviously that, humanly is it's not really possible to do what he did, and which is incredible. But anyway, so there is a length of backswing issue there from chest height to chest height. So the measurement doesn't count if I only get to shoulder height, is my
Yeah.
point. We've got to sort of lengthen that out to a reasonably full backswing range. So that would be law number one. And certainly I'd encourage you with your own swing, if you're looking for more speed, certainly to continue on that journey of trying to increase that length of swing. That would be your easiest low hanging fruit for speed.
It's a work in progress, my friend. And I'm on the Rotex plates. I'm doing it all. So we're on the way there. Okay. So you've hit us with some incredible information. Let's touch the final, um, commonality between great ball strikers, good golf swings, efficient golf swings. And that was the golf club's center of mass location. Now, in the interest of understanding, I want you to describe to the golfer where the center of mass of the club is, and then how this responds as the golf club, or how it acts, I should say, through space as the golf club's traveling around the body.
Yeah, exactly. So a club center of mass is when we look at basically we've got a grip, a shaft, and a club head.
Mhm.
Well, when we think of the club head weight, we think of the club head as the only weight. But in reality, there's some weight in the grip and there's some weight in the shaft. So we look at a club's what we call overall center of mass. If we were to balance this club on a pin, it wouldn't balance on the club head. It would balance on a point that's, let's say, 6 or 8 inches up the shaft.
Hmm.
And that would be the point where the club would balance. The center of mass would actually be out in space somewhere outside the shaft. So if you drew a line between, let's say, just at the bottom of the grip to the club head, and you drew a line along that, the center of mass would actually sit slightly outside of that. So when you hold a club up in front of you and go, okay, I know where the club face is, you're not actually feeling the club head. You're feeling the club's overall center of mass, which happens to be above the shaft, which is why when you twist it, you can sense it. You can sense how the mass moved and changed.
Hmm.
And for a good player, that is the game, to a large extent. And I love talking to my tour players and other great players because it's always interesting what they say. They said, "Oh, the club was in the slot today.
Yeah.
It felt like I could hit it as hard as I wanted, and I'd look up and see this ball go straight." And what they're describing is exactly that. That club center of mass is in a certain location that they can respond to that in a very powerful way. And they feel like I could add speed to this, I could hit it soft, I could hit it hard, and I'm still seeing this ball, kind of do what we want. And those are obviously magical days. And, we wish every day was that simple. So that proverbial in the slot is really the location of that center of mass. And for good players in particular, they're going to respond to that. They know what they're trying to do with that club at impact. If I've got a 7-iron with 11 degrees of shaft lean at impact, they know how to position themselves to be able to make the club do that.
Hmm.
And that's why if a player is under a tree, for example, they've got to make a massive modification to their swing plane, they don't miss the ball,
Yeah.
right? But your average golfer would, because all of a sudden their awareness level of where that center of mass is not near as honed. So when they flatten their swing or they've got to adjust their swing because of a tree branch, right? They whiff the ball, they miss the ball. But very rarely would a tour player do that because they've got an innate sense of where that golf club actually is.
Hmm.
So when we look at how quickly a player can move, a lot of that is tied into where that mass is approaching the golf ball from. A club comes down steep, we get, kind of Charles Barkley, and we get this club out here somewhere. I mean, a good player is going to freak out. They're going to stand up, they're going to tilt, they're going to
Yeah.
back out of it
Hmm.
10 times out of 10. Okay. Your average golfer comes straight over the top and, has a path that's 15 degrees left and either hits it in the left trees or, obviously has a very weak slice.
Hmm.
So nothing changes the way that a body moves, at least for better players or let's say even medium level players, as to where that club center of mass is being placed. From a leverage and speed perspective, a good rule of thumb is we're always trying to make a movement that's roughly, sort of 90 degrees to the club center of mass. So when you're there at the top of your swing and you move laterally and downward, that force that you're applying to the grip is moving this sort of in a position that's roughly, let's say, along the shaft early, but the overall pull on the handle is somewhat 90 degrees. By the time you get to around P6 or last parallel at waist height, right, we are now starting to push back and out of the way so that we can, again, continually move ahead of the center of mass and get out of that inertia and allow that club to release or do whatever we're trying to do with it. Um, so it's kind of fascinating when we see that. So a lot of times, to your point about lighter clubs and heavier clubs, when we're talking about club fitting, as soon as we change that swing weight dramatically, you'll see the swing change massively
Yes.
because all of a sudden that center of mass is not where it was a minute ago.
Hmm.
And you'll see a player respond completely differently to that mass. And for some players, personally, I like a very heavy swing weight. I like the feel of a lot of mass there. I feel like I've got something to pull on. Okay. When for me, the swing weight gets very, very light, I feel like, okay, I don't know where this is. I feel like my arms get down here too fast. I feel like it's already past me.
Yeah.
So that's where, again, obviously with when you're talking to your tour players, I mean, it's always amazing when you see their specs on their clubs and some players like ultra heavy, some players like light, some players like skinny grips, some players like fat grips. You've got all these little things, but what they're really doing is they're playing around with that overall center of mass and where that is to the player.
Yeah. This I feel like because a lot of these things you've given advice on how to, improve the chest height to chest height or the ranges of motion, with Pilates and stuff. And this I feel like all golfers would be well served to go and really get in touch with their golf clubs because, to develop that awareness of where the center of mass is. Personally, I'm going to hit you with a couple things that I advise people to do, and then I'd like you to come back and discount or give us your opinion. I'll have a player hold a club and without a golf ball, swing back to like left arm parallel or lead arm parallel. And then I'm like, okay, tilt the club behind you to where it feels heavy. Now go in the opposite direction to where it feels heavy. Now find light. And between those two heavy areas, lightish, they'll start to get a sense for where the angle of the club is in relation to their body. And so that's one way. And then another way is I have them hold two clubs independently, left and right hand, and say, look, you've got a couple, 3 inches between these. Swing back and forth, just waist high to waist high initially. And let's try and get those clubs to work in concert with each other. And you'll see
Right.
people banging clubs against each other all the time until they get aware of how they need to move to allow these clubs to sit on the angles that they're supposed to perform on. You agree?
Yeah, I love that drill. I think you've nailed it there. I mean, that's a beautiful drill. You can always sense a player in terms of their dominance as well with
Yes.
that drill. You'll see them, right hand dominant players will obviously handle that very easily, and then the left one's flopping around all over the place, and vice versa. But it's a beautiful drill to build, for lack of better words, synchronicity between the left side of the body and the right. And to your point, one of the things I love about golf swings is we can hash it out and geek it out and get all to this micro level, but we can also talk about things in a very vague sense, if you will, which is, where is the weight of this thing?
Yes.
And the old test, with tour players, you could close their eyes and they could spin the shaft around and they could tell within 5 minutes of where that club face was, without opening their eyes, because of the sensitivity
Yes.
of where that mass is they understand what that feels like when it's open and when it's closed. And I mean, that's a beautiful drill. You want to be better at golf, learn to become aware of the subtle changes in where the center of mass is. So not only from a rotational standpoint of where this is positioned around the shaft, but to your point, what feels too heavy,
Yeah.
what feels too light, okay, what feels in between.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a beautiful, beautiful drill for them to be able to get a sense of, a plane or a workable swing plane that they can use. And the nice thing is we can be very vague with that. We don't have to get all crazy and scientific. We just say, make it feel a little lighter, make it
Yeah.
feel a little heavier. And that's really where the magic of golf instruction is, taking a very complex idea, obviously, and making it very, very simple for the student. So both those drills, I certainly love, and I think that players, who are listening here, anything that you can do to build that awareness of where the club center of mass is, both from a rotational standpoint as well as a location standpoint, those are going to serve you well in terms of becoming a better player and a more repeatable ball striker.
Here's an opinion question, and I'm just throwing this out there, and I'm sure it's very generic, and you would poke holes in it. But I often, throughout my career as a teacher, um, you'll have a player come to you and and they go, "Well, I'm a field player," and then the other person will go, "No, I'm more of a technical sort of a person." But I don't care what sort of side of the spectrum you fit in. Great ball strikers have a sense for where the golf club is throughout space and also in relation to themselves. And
Mm.
so wherever they are, because the challenge to golf is you don't play off flat lies all the time. Everything is always changing. So awareness of that center of mass and where the club moves around one is kind of also a hallmark to reliable and great ball strikers. You would agree?
Yeah, 1,000%. And adaptability at the highest
Yeah.
levels is probably the biggest difference. Is how do I hit great shots off side hill lies and uphill lies, and in the pouring rain, and still be able to get this thing done. And that goes back to our list there with our dynamic balance and all these different things that we see with great ball strikers. Is we've got to be able to adapt to the track that we're racing on that day, for a similar analogy. And when we look at the ability of players to, like I would say, there's a lot of really, really, really poor mechanically technical swings on the PGA Tour that are making millions of dollars every year.
Truth. Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And simply is, their awareness levels are so high. It's the theory of the repeatable error. If I make the same repeatable error every single time, I'm going to see a repeatable result that I can use. And so in our quest to maybe build the perfect machine and these great swings, we have to understand that it's not a drag strip. It's a curvy road that we have to navigate. So we've got to be able to turn and adapt and change power and do all the things that we would when we're racing a car. And, as a result, part of our training certainly has to build a very powerful, very repeatable car, if you will. But I also need to learn to race that car.
Yeah, preach it.
And, you know, I think there's a lot of great players in this day and age that have beautiful golf swings, but don't race very well, and vice versa. I think there's some incredible, drivers who have very poor cars that are able to capitalize and, let's say, overperform, based on the quality of their car. They've learned that awareness is very, very high, and or a very high level there of that awareness. So I think as we rep things out, I think that there's not a single player in history that hasn't beat a lot of golf balls in a
Yes.
lot of different weather conditions and a lot of different grasses and a lot of different parts of the world to develop an awareness level that they can feel in these difficult moments. That may be a conversation for another day, but certainly, as you said, that awareness level we continue to build. When you become a 10 handicap, right, you're a decent player, but your awareness level is not as good as a scratch. And that scratch player is, not going to have the awareness level of a player who's a, +6 or +7 at the top of the PGA Tour.
And you add to that, this is another podcast. I'm going to hold you to that, because those are just the external environment things, because then the body and the emotions and stuff are running rampant, and adrenaline's surging, and then everything feels different anyway. So we'll talk about that in the future. Scott, you've taken us on a beautiful journey throughout building wrong word, throughout understanding what makes reliable golf swings. And you've done it in such a wonderfully easy to digest and understand manner. So thank you. It begs the question, because I'm sure folks will want to get in touch. How do they get to you? What's the social media? What's the website and such, please?
Yeah, best case is Scott Cowx Certified on Instagram is where most of my stuff ends up. So Scott Cowx Certified, and they can DM me there. They can reach out there. They can email me. All that contact information is in my bio. I do awful lot of work online. I've got clients in 48 countries of the world. So we can certainly hopefully help a lot of players. So if they're interested, certainly reach out and we can chat.
It would be worth your while, folks. He truly is one of the best. Scott, thank you. I so appreciate you and your time.
No problem, my friend. Thank you so much for having me on, and I look forward to seeing this hopefully in the next week or so.